March 15, 1943, Smithfield Meat Market, London. 5 stories beneath the cobblestones of the City of London, behind a protective wall of frozen beef carcasses, Dr. Max Perutz adjusts his electrically heated flight suit against the sub-zero cold. The young crystallographer raises a Lee Enfield rifle and aims at 2 blocks resting on makeshift stands. Each block measures 2 feet square and 1 foot thick. The first is clear, crystalline ice. The second appears cloudy, its surface embedded with fibrous material. A handful of British commandos, assigned as his laboratory assistants in this strangest of secret facilities, watch from behind a barrier of hanging meat. This is insane. We're firing rifles in a freezer beneath a butcher shop. Perutz squeezes the trigger. The shot echoes through the meat locker. The ice block explodes into a shower of glittering fragments that ricochet off the frozen carcasses, exactly as expected. He chambers another round and aims at the second block. The rifle cracks. The bullet strikes the cloudy material and stops. No explosion, no fragmentation. The round simply embeds itself in a small crater on the surface, doing no structural damage whatsoever. One of the commandos breaks the silence. "Bloody hell, sir, what is that?" Perutz approaches the block and examines the impact point. The bullet has penetrated less than 3 inches into material that looks like dirty ice, but behaves like concrete. "Pykrete," he says, quietly. 14% wood pulp, 86% frozen water, and apparently bulletproof. What Perutz doesn't yet know, because security protocols forbid anyone from telling him, is that this material is destined for the hull of the largest warship ever conceived. An aircraft carrier built not from steel, but from a glacier. A vessel so massive it would displace more tonnage than the entire Royal Navy combined. A ship that would be, by design, unsinkable. But there it was, proof that changed everything. The material for a ship that was, by design, unsinkable. If you want to see how this audacious plan unfolded and whether it ever left the drawing board, support us with a like. It helps us uncover more buried stories like this. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now, back to the dire situation that necessitated such madness. The year is 1943, and Britain is drowning. German U-boats rule a vast stretch of the North Atlantic beyond the reach of land-based aircraft, a killing zone the Admiralty calls the Atlantic Gap. In this maritime graveyard, merchant ships die at a rate of 60 per month. Britain imports 17 million tons of supplies annually to survive. At current loss rates, the island will starve before victory comes. Steel is rationed, aluminum is precious. Conventional aircraft carriers take 18 months to build, and there aren't enough shipyards to build them anyway. Britain needs a solution that doesn't require resources it doesn't have, a weapon so audacious that even proposing it seems like madness. And now, in a frozen meat locker beneath central London, that weapon has just stopped a bullet. The journey to this revelation had begun 13 months earlier, in February 1942, when Geoffrey Pyke, an eccentric inventor working for Lord Louis Mountbatten's Combined Operations Headquarters, confronted an engineering problem that conventional wisdom deemed unsolvable. Pyke was 48 years old, balding, disheveled, and possessed of a mind that attacked problems from angles no one else considered. He wore the same threadbare suit for weeks. He carried notebooks filled with calculations that linked seemingly unrelated concepts. His previous proposals to combined operations included drugging commandos with sleeping pills to transport them behind enemy lines via torpedo tubes. Mountbatten valued him precisely because he thought differently than everyone else in the War Office. The problem Pyke focused on in early 1942 was simple in concept, devastating in implication. Allied shipping was being massacred in the mid-Atlantic Gap, a 600-mile wide stretch of ocean beyond the operational range of shore-based patrol aircraft. Convoy escorts could protect ships closer to land, but in the Gap itself, submarines operated with near impunity. Between January and March 1942 alone, U-boats sank 216 ships totaling 1.2 million tons. Pyke's solution emerged during a visit to the United States in March 1942, create mobile air bases in the middle of the Atlantic. Not aircraft carriers in the traditional sense, those required steel Britain didn't have and shipyards already at capacity. Instead, Pyke envisioned platforms made from icebergs. Natural icebergs were abundant, free, and already floating. The International Ice Patrol had proven after the Titanic disaster that icebergs were effectively indestructible. Bombs and torpedoes made no meaningful impact. The concept was elegantly simple. Tow a large iceberg into position, level its top surface to create a landing strip, hollow out its interior for storage and quarters, install engines for propulsion. An unsinkable fortress made from frozen water. Pyke presented the idea to Lord Mountbatten in April 1942. Mountbatten, then Chief of Combined Operations and one of the few senior officers willing to entertain unconventional concepts, saw immediate potential. The plan required no steel for the hull. Ice could be shaped and modified. An iceberg platform wouldn't sink no matter how many torpedoes struck it. Mountbatten gave Pyke authorization to explore the concept's feasibility. The project needed scientific validation. Mountbatten and Pyke recruited Dr. Max Perutz, a 28-year-old Austrian refugee and crystallographer who specialized in the molecular structure of ice. Perutz had fled Vienna when Nazi Germany annexed Austria in 1938. He'd been briefly interned as an enemy alien in 1940 before his scientific credentials secured his release. Now he worked at Cambridge's Cavendish Laboratory, studying protein crystals. Perutz reviewed Pyke's proposal in May 1942 and delivered unwelcome news. Natural icebergs wouldn't work. Their geometry was wrong. Only about 10% of an iceberg's mass sits above water, insufficient for a useful landing strip. Worse, icebergs were prone to sudden rolling as their submerged portions melted unevenly, which would be catastrophic with aircraft trying to land on top. Finally, moving and shaping a natural iceberg presented insurmountable engineering challenges. The project appeared dead. Then Pyke discovered a research paper by Dr. Hermann Mark and Dr. Walter Hohenstein at the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn. Mark had been Perutz's professor of physical chemistry in Vienna before fleeing the Nazis. His research focused on reinforcing brittle plastics by embedding fibrous materials, similar to how steel rebar reinforces concrete. Mark and Hohenstein had experimented with freezing water mixed with cotton fibers or wood pulp. The results were remarkable. The frozen composite was dramatically stronger than pure ice. Perutz received the report from Pyke in June 1942. He read it with growing excitement. The material Mark described could solve every problem with natural icebergs. It could be manufactured to any desired shape. It would be stronger, tougher, and slower melting than pure ice. Most importantly, it could be repaired at sea simply by adding more slurry and letting it freeze. The ocean itself became an unlimited repair facility. Perutz needed space to test the concept. Mountbatten provided a solution characteristic of wartime improvisation, a refrigerated meat locker 5 stories beneath Smithfield Market, normally used to store beef carcasses for London's butcher shops. Security was absolute, hidden behind walls of frozen meat, with only Perutz and a team of disguised British commandos knowing what happened inside. Through summer and fall 1942, Perutz systematically tested different compositions. Pure ice was too brittle. Too much wood pulp made the material structurally unsound. He settled on an optimal ratio, 14% wood pulp by weight, 86% water. When frozen, this mixture exhibited crushing strength comparable to concrete, approximately 1,100 pounds per square inch. Unlike ice, which shattered under impact, the composite absorbed bullets and stopped them. Thermal conductivity was low enough that melting occurred at roughly 1/7 the rate of pure ice. They named it Pykrete, honoring the man whose unconventional thinking had sparked the project. By December 1942, Perutz had proven the concept scientifically viable. Pyke and Mountbatten took the findings to Prime Minister Winston Churchill. What happened next entered the realm of legend, though the truth remains debated. According to Mountbatten's own after-dinner accounts years later, he brought a block of Pykrete to Churchill's residence at Chequers and found the Prime Minister in his bath. Mountbatten dropped the sample into the steaming water. The outer layer melted, but the exposed wood pulp insulated the interior. The block continued floating for hours. Whether or not Churchill was actually in his bathtub, the Prime Minister's enthusiasm was real. On December 4, 1942, Churchill issued a memo stamped "Most Secret," approving construction of a prototype. He wanted the vessel to be 2,000 feet long, 300 feet wide, with a displacement exceeding 2 million tons. It would carry 200 single-engine fighters and 100 twin-engine bombers. Its hull would be 40 feet thick, impervious to any torpedo in the German arsenal. Churchill assigned the project the code name Habakkuk. Through early 1943, Project Habakkuk evolved from theoretical concept to detailed engineering specifications. The stakes could not have been higher. German U-boats were winning the Battle of the Atlantic. In January 1943, submarines sank 37 ships. In February, 63 ships. In March 1943, the darkest month of the entire U-boat campaign, the toll reached 108 ships sunk, representing 627,000 tons of Allied shipping destroyed in just 31 days. At that rate, Britain's maritime supply lines would collapse before American industrial production could reverse the tide. The proposed Habakkuk carrier represented a potential solution of staggering scope. Final specifications called for a vessel measuring 2,000 feet in length and 300 feet in beam, longer than 2.5 Titanics placed end to end. The hull would measure 40 feet thick, composed entirely of Pykrete, maintained at -16 degrees Celsius to prevent plastic deformation. Total displacement would exceed 2.2 million tons. For comparison, the Essex-class carriers being built in American shipyards displaced 27,000 tons each. A single Habakkuk would outweigh 80 conventional carriers. The design team, led by naval architect J.D. Bernal, planned for 26 electric motors mounted in external nacelles along the hull to provide propulsion. Internal engines would generate too much heat for an ice vessel. Maximum speed would be approximately 7 knots, slower than conventional carriers, but adequate for maintaining position in the mid-Atlantic gap. The flight deck would accommodate 150 twin-engine bombers with operational range sufficient to patrol 600 miles in every direction. The vessel would carry enough aviation fuel for 5,000 miles of operations. Defensive armament would include 40 dual-purpose 4.5-inch turrets for anti-aircraft and surface defense. The crew would number approximately 3,620 officers and enlisted personnel. Onboard refrigeration plants powered by diesel generators would circulate freezing air at -30 degrees Celsius through miles of ducting embedded in the Pykrete hull, compensating for atmospheric heat and maintaining structural integrity indefinitely. The most remarkable feature was the ship's effective invulnerability. A conventional torpedo warhead, even a direct hit amidships, would create a crater perhaps 15 feet deep in the 40-foot thick hull, damaging but not catastrophic. The damaged section could be repaired at sea by pumping seawater mixed with wood pulp into forms around the crater and allowing the mixture to freeze. Within days, the hull would be restored to full integrity. The ship couldn't sink because Pykrete floated naturally. It couldn't be destroyed by gunfire because the material absorbed shells without shattering. Mounting enthusiasm faced a critical test, proving the concept worked at scale. In January 1943, the National Research Council of Canada received orders to construct a prototype on Patricia Lake in Jasper National Park, Alberta. The location was chosen for its reliable sub-zero temperatures, proximity to rail connections at Jasper, and existing security infrastructure from nearby paratrooper training facilities. Dr. C.J. McKenzie, president of the National Research Council, received the assignment with profound skepticism. He initially described it as another of those mad, wild schemes for which the British were becoming notorious. Nevertheless, his team began construction in February 1943. The prototype was designed as a 1 to 10 scale cross-section test, 60 feet long, 30 feet wide, approximately 20 feet in height, weighing 1,000 tons. Workers were conscientious objectors, primarily Mennonite and Doukhobor community members who had refused military service on religious grounds but accepted alternative labor assignments. They were never informed what they were building. To outside observers, the structure resembled a large boathouse sitting on the frozen lake surface. Construction proceeded through February and March 1943. Workers first cleared snow from a section of frozen lake and erected a wooden frame covered by an insulated roof. The structure was filled with blocks cut from lake ice, pure ice initially, before Pykrete production was fully established. A refrigeration system consisting of 3 Freon compressors powered by 10-horsepower electric motors circulated cold air through 6-inch galvanized iron ducts embedded in the ice. By mid-March 1943, the prototype was complete. Initial tests in April proved the refrigeration system could maintain frozen integrity even as spring temperatures rose. By July 1943, with external air temperatures exceeding 70 degrees Fahrenheit, thermocouples embedded in the structure measured core temperatures remaining at 14 degrees Fahrenheit, -10 degrees Celsius. The system was working. The Canadian team conducted stress tests. They fired artillery shells at the hull. The Pykrete absorbed the impacts without catastrophic damage. They simulated battle damage by cutting sections away, then repaired them by adding fresh Pykrete mixture and allowing it to freeze. The repairs integrated seamlessly with the original structure. Every test validated the fundamental concept. By August 1943, the prototype had proven Pykrete's viability as a construction material for ships. The question was no longer whether such a vessel could be built. The question was whether it should be. But by mid-1943, the strategic picture was changing faster than Habakkuk could be built. The very crisis that had sparked the project's urgency was beginning to resolve itself through other means. May 1943 marked the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. That month, German U-boats suffered unprecedented losses. 41 submarines destroyed by Allied anti-submarine warfare improvements, including enhanced radar, better depth charges, and increased numbers of escort carriers. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz withdrew his U-boat fleet from the North Atlantic convoy routes on May 24, 1943. The slaughter of merchant shipping dropped dramatically. In June, 34 ships were lost. In July, 23. The Atlantic gap was closing. 3 technological and strategic developments were making Habakkuk obsolete before it could be completed. First, Portugal granted Britain access to airfields in the Azores in August 1943. The Azores sat precisely in the middle of the Atlantic gap. Land-based aircraft operating from these bases could now patrol the entire convoy route. The need for a mobile mid-Atlantic airbase diminished significantly. Second, escort carriers, converted merchant ships with flight decks, were entering service in increasing numbers. These vessels provided convoy protection without requiring the massive resource investment Habakkuk demanded. By summer 1943, dozens of escort carriers were operational. They were fast, maneuverable, and carried sufficient aircraft for anti-submarine patrol. Third, very long-range aircraft equipped with improved radar and extended fuel tanks were closing the Atlantic gap from both directions. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, modified for maritime patrol, could now cover 2,400 miles with sufficient fuel reserves for extended patrol time. The Atlantic gap was shrinking to a narrow corridor that escort carriers could adequately cover. Meanwhile, the cost projections for Habakkuk were escalating alarmingly. Max Perutz's experiments at Smithfield had revealed a critical problem. Pykrete exhibited plastic flow under sustained pressure at temperatures above -15 degrees Celsius, approximately 5 degrees Fahrenheit. The material would literally sag and deform over time unless kept well below freezing. This meant the refrigeration requirements were far greater than initially estimated. By May 1943, Perutz calculated that maintaining the full-scale vessel's structural integrity would require massive additional steel reinforcement embedded in the Pykrete hull, steel that Britain had originally hoped to avoid using. The refrigeration plant needed to maintain -16 degrees Celsius throughout 2.2 million tons of Pykrete would require more steel than building a conventional aircraft carrier from steel alone. The irony was devastating. A project conceived to conserve strategic materials now demanded more of those materials than conventional alternatives. Cost estimates grew accordingly. Initial projections of £1 million escalated to £2.5 million by May, then to estimates approaching £10 million by August, enough to build multiple conventional carriers. Required materials included 300,000 tons of wood pulp, enough to significantly impact paper production, 25,000 tons of cork insulation, 35,000 tons of timber, and 10,000 tons of steel for machinery and reinforcement. The Canadian team delivered further discouraging news. Constructing the full-scale vessel during winter 1943-1944 was impossible. The engineering challenges of fabricating 280,000 40-foot Pykrete blocks while maintaining frozen conditions throughout were far more complex than anticipated. The earliest realistic completion date was late 1945. Naval architects presented 3 alternative designs at a Chiefs of Staff meeting in August 1943. Habakkuk 1 used conventional wood construction and was quickly dismissed. Habakkuk 2 matched the original Pykrete concept, but with the escalated cost and complexity now understood. Habakkuk 3 proposed a smaller, faster version. None appeared practical given resource constraints and the changing strategic situation. Political dynamics also shifted. Lord Mountbatten, the project's most powerful champion, was appointed Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia Command in October 1943. His focus turned to the Pacific Theater. Without Mountbatten's advocacy at the highest levels, support for Habakkuk weakened. Geoffrey Pyke himself was excluded from planning discussions in a deliberate effort to secure American participation. U.S. Navy officials had been skeptical from the start, and Pyke's abrasive personality during earlier meetings had alienated potential supporters. When American naval engineers evaluated the project, they concluded that conventional carriers served the same purpose more effectively with proven technology and established supply chains. The final meeting of the Habakkuk board took place in December 1943. Representatives from Combined Operations Headquarters, the Admiralty, the National Research Council of Canada, and American Naval Engineering reviewed all available data. The conclusion was unanimous and final. The large Habakkuk 2 made of Pykrete has been found to be impractical because of the enormous production resources required and technical difficulties involved. Project Habakkuk was officially terminated. The prototype on Patricia Lake had its refrigeration equipment and roof removed in August 1943. Through fall 1943 and winter 1943-1944, the structure slowly melted. By spring 1944, most of the Pykrete had returned to liquid water. The wooden framing, steel refrigeration pipes, and motor mountings sank to the lake bottom, where they remain today at a depth of approximately 50 feet. Pykrete later wrote in his memoir that the U.S. Navy's final assessment crystallized the project's fundamental paradox. The enormous amount of steel needed for the refrigeration plant that was to freeze the Pykrete was greater than that needed to build the entire carrier of steel. But the crucial argument was that the rapidly increasing range of land-based aircraft rendered floating islands unnecessary. The war's largest proposed warship would never be built. But the demonstration that an ice ship could exist, that Pykrete worked as promised, represented a different kind of victory. Understanding why Britain pursued a glacier aircraft carrier requires understanding the resource mathematics of industrial war in 1942-1943. The specifications that drove Habakkuk's design originated in an Admiralty memorandum dated March 1942, shortly after the devastating convoy losses of early that year. The requirements were brutally specific. Britain needed air coverage over the Atlantic Gap, the 600-mile stretch beyond range of land-based aircraft. Conventional carriers couldn't fill this gap in sufficient numbers given steel shortages and shipyard capacity constraints. The weapon had to be buildable with materials Britain possessed in abundance while consuming minimal quantities of scarce strategic resources. Ice was the answer to this equation. Britain had unlimited access to cold water. Freezing water into ice required only about 1% of the energy needed to produce an equivalent mass of steel. Wood pulp was abundant, produced as a byproduct of timber industry operations. The conceptual elegance was undeniable. Construct the world's largest warship from materials that cost almost nothing. Geoffrey Pyke understood that the project's audacity was its strength. Traditional engineering approaches had been optimized to death. Conventional carriers were as efficient as they could be, but Britain still couldn't build enough of them fast enough. Breaking the paradigm meant accepting that a 7-knot ice fortress was actually more valuable than a 30-knot steel carrier that didn't exist. The design philosophy that emerged was driven by 3 core principles that shaped every technical decision. First, survivability through mass. A conventional carrier's armor was limited by weight constraints. Add too much protection and the vessel becomes dangerously slow and unstable. Habakkuk inverted this logic. The 40-foot-thick Pykrete hull wasn't armor in the conventional sense, it was the ship itself. Torpedoes that would sink a steel carrier would merely create craters in Habakkuk's hull, repairable at sea, using seawater and wood pulp. The ship couldn't sink because Pykrete floated naturally. It couldn't be destroyed by gunfire because there was simply too much of it to eliminate. Mass became the ultimate defense. Second, regeneration as a design feature. Conventional ships are static objects. Damage reduces their capability until they reach a repair facility. Habakkuk was designed to be a living system that could restore itself at sea. Battle damage would be repaired by pumping Pykrete slurry into forms around craters and allowing it to freeze. The ocean itself became an unlimited supply depot. This capability fundamentally changed damage control calculations. Habakkuk could operate indefinitely without returning to port for hull repairs. Third, accepting fundamental trade-offs that would be unthinkable in conventional design. 7 knots maximum speed meant the ship could never escape a faster enemy, but it didn't need to. It was meant to sit in the mid-Atlantic gap and survive whatever came at it. The massive refrigeration requirements meant the ship consumed significant power just to maintain its structural integrity, but power generation technology was mature and reliable. The vessel's enormous size made it a conspicuous target, but being impossible to sink made conspicuousness irrelevant. The engineering specifications reflected these principles. The 40-foot-thick hull was calculated based on torpedo warhead yield. A standard German G7E torpedo carried a 617-pound warhead that could create a crater approximately 12 to 15 feet deep in Pykrete. The 40-foot thickness provided 3 times the minimum necessary to prevent catastrophic through-hull penetration. Walls this thick would remain structurally sound even after multiple torpedo strikes. The refrigeration system was engineered with redundancy and excess capacity. 4 separate diesel-electric power plants would generate 33,000 horsepower total to run 26 propulsion motors and the refrigeration compressors. Cold air at negative 30 degrees Celsius would circulate through miles of ducting embedded in the hull, each section independently controllable. If one refrigeration plant failed, the remaining 3 could maintain frozen conditions throughout the structure. The system was designed to operate continuously for years without major maintenance. Aircraft capacity was determined by strategic range calculations. The Handley Page Halifax bomber, the primary anticipated aircraft, had an operational radius of 600 miles. Housing 150 such aircraft would allow continuous patrol coverage over a 360-degree radius around Habakkuk's position, closing the Atlantic Gap completely. Landing and takeoff operations were designed for 20-minute cycles. If weather permitted, the entire air group could launch in under 2 hours. The design team recognized they were creating something unprecedented. This wasn't a ship in the traditional sense. It was a mobile island, a floating fortress that happened to be able to move slowly under its own power. The conceptual breakthrough was accepting that conventional metrics of naval performance didn't apply. Habakkuk wasn't faster or more maneuverable or more heavily armed than contemporary carriers. It was something different, immortal. The decision to build from ice was, at its core, a declaration that in total war, engineering constraints matter less than industrial capacity. Britain couldn't produce enough steel. It could produce unlimited Pykrete. In a conflict where production determined survival, using what you had was more important than using what was optimal. This philosophy, build weapons from whatever resources exist in abundance, accept unconventional trade-offs, prioritize construction speed over theoretical perfection, would define Britain's approach to industrial warfare through the remainder of the conflict. Habakkuk failed, but the thinking that produced it succeeded. When Britain needed landing facilities for the D-Day invasion, they built mulberry harbors, artificial ports constructed from concrete caissons that could be towed across the English Channel. When they needed to cross rivers, they built Bailey bridges from prefabricated steel components that trucks could carry. The lesson was clear: conventional optimality mattered less than unconventional availability. Geoffrey Pyke never saw another of his proposals reach advanced development. The establishment he had challenged by suggesting they build a ship from ice largely dismissed him after Habakkuk's cancellation. He continued proposing radical solutions to military problems, schemes the War Office increasingly viewed as distractions from practical work. On February 22, 1948, Pyke took a fatal overdose of sleeping pills. He was 54 years old. Max Perutz returned to molecular biology. The crystallographic skills he'd developed studying ice structures proved applicable to proteins. In 1962, he won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for determining the molecular structure of hemoglobin. He died in 2002, widely regarded as one of the century's most accomplished biochemists. In his memoir, he wrote of Habakkuk with a mixture of pride and frustration: pride that the science worked, frustration that politics and practicality prevented its realization. Though Habakkuk never launched, the project's impact on wartime innovation and post-war engineering was substantial. The consequences unfolded across multiple dimensions: strategic, technological, and philosophical. The immediate strategic consequence was that Britain proceeded with conventional solutions to the Atlantic Gap. The combination of escort carriers, long-range patrol aircraft operating from the Azores, and improved anti-submarine tactics proved sufficient. By late 1943, Allied shipping losses had declined to sustainable levels. In the last year of the European War, U-boats sank only 132 Allied merchant ships, less than 2 months' worth of losses from early 1943. The crisis that had made Habakkuk seem necessary had passed. But the resources invested in Habakkuk weren't wasted. The research into Pykrete generated valuable understanding of ice behavior under structural loads, knowledge that proved useful for Arctic military operations later in the war and during subsequent Cold War deployments. Perutz's work on ice crystal structures and plastic flow informed glaciology research for decades. His 1948 paper, A Description of the Iceberg Aircraft Carrier and the Bearing of the Mechanical Properties of Frozen Wood Pulp upon Some Problems of Glacier Flow, became a foundational text in the field. The prototype on Patricia Lake demonstrated that large-scale refrigeration systems could maintain frozen structures in ambient temperatures well above freezing for extended periods. This capability would later inform cold storage technology for food preservation and industrial refrigeration. During the 1950s, several Arctic construction projects referenced the Habakkuk refrigeration data when designing permanently frozen structures in permafrost regions. Technologically, Habakkuk pushed the boundaries of composite materials engineering. The concept of reinforcing a brittle matrix with fibrous materials, in this case wood pulp reinforcing ice, was relatively novel in 1943. While composite materials had been used before, Pykrete represented one of the first systematic attempts to engineer composite properties for large-scale structural applications. The principles validated by Perutz's experiments would inform fiberglass development in the late 1940s and carbon fiber composites in subsequent decades. The project also validated certain approaches to rapid prototyping and iterative design. The decision to build a 1-to-10 scale test model rather than proceeding directly to full construction allowed engineers to identify critical problems: plastic flow, refrigeration capacity requirements, structural integration challenges before committing massive resources. This methodology of scale testing became standard practice for subsequent large-scale military projects. More broadly, Habakkuk represented a philosophical approach to wartime engineering that prioritized speed and unconventional solutions over theoretical optimality. The British were willing to attempt building a 2.2 million-ton ice ship because waiting for perfect conventional solutions meant losing the war. This mindset produced numerous successful improvisations: the Mulberry harbors that supplied Allied forces at Normandy, the Pluto pipeline that delivered fuel across the English Channel, the bouncing bomb that breached German dams. Some worked spectacularly, some, like Habakkuk, proved impractical, but all reflected a willingness to attempt the unprecedented when conventional approaches couldn't scale fast enough. The human cost of Habakkuk was minimal. No lives were lost during construction or testing. The financial cost was significant but not catastrophic, approximately £1.5 million spent on research, prototyping, and engineering studies before cancellation. For comparison, this equaled the cost of roughly 8 Spitfire fighter squadrons, including aircraft and pilot training. The opportunity cost was harder to calculate. The scientists, engineers, and resources devoted to Habakkuk could theoretically have been deployed elsewhere. But Britain's situation in 1942-1943 was so desperate that even long-shot projects warranted pursuit if they might provide strategic advantage. The project's cancellation in December 1943 was handled quietly. No public announcement was made. Habakkuk remained classified information throughout the war and for years afterward. The prototype on Patricia Lake continued melting through spring and summer 1944. By the time Allied forces landed at Normandy in June 1944, the ice ship existed only as wooden debris and steel piping at the bottom of an Alberta lake. After the war, occasional references to Habakkuk appeared in memoirs and historical accounts. Mountbatten mentioned it in after-dinner speeches, often embellishing details for dramatic effect. Pykrete wrote about it in scientific journals. But the project remained largely unknown outside naval history circles until the 1960s, when declassified documents allowed fuller public accounting of this remarkable footnote to World War II. In 1988, the Underwater Archaeological Society of Alberta marked the prototype site with an underwater plaque. Divers can visit the remains at the bottom of Patricia Lake, wooden beams, refrigeration pipes, and metal fittings that are all that's left of Britain's attempt to build a carrier from ice. The lake itself is part of Jasper National Park, protected as a natural area and historical site. Project specifications: proposed length 2,000 feet, 600 meters, proposed beam 300 feet, 91 meters, proposed displacement 2,200,000 tons, hull thickness 40 feet, 12 meters of Pykrete, propulsion 26 electric motors generating approximately 33,000 horsepower total, maximum speed 7 knots, 8 miles per hour, range 7,000 miles. Aircraft capacity 150 twin-engine bombers or equivalent. Armament 40 dual-purpose 4.5-inch turrets. Crew complement approximately 3,620 officers and enlisted personnel. Material requirements estimated for full-scale vessel. Pykrete composition 14% wood pulp, 86% ice by weight. Total wood pulp required approximately 300,000 tons. Total water/ice required approximately 1,900,000 tons. Cork insulation 25,000 tons. Structural timber 35,000 tons. Steel for machinery and reinforcement 10,000 tons. Prototype specifications: length 60 feet, 18 meters, beam 30 feet, 9 meters, weight 1,000 tons. Refrigeration system: 3 Freon compressors powered by 10 horsepower motors. Construction time approximately 2 months, February to March 1943. Construction location: Patricia Lake, Jasper National Park, Alberta, Canada. Operational test period: April to August 1943. Project timeline: initial concept, February 1942. Churchill approval, December 4, 1942. Smithfield experiments, June 1942 to April 1943. Patricia Lake prototype construction, February to March 1943. Official cancellation, December 1943. Total project duration, 22 months. Financial accounting, total expenditure approximately £1.5 million through cancellation. Estimated full-scale construction cost, £5 to £10 million. For comparison, Essex-class carrier cost approximately $78 million, £20 million. Patricia Lake today is quiet. Tourists paddle canoes across its surface in summer. Ice fishermen drill holes through its frozen surface in winter. Few visitors realize that 50 feet below lies scattered debris from one of history's most audacious engineering projects: wooden beams, steel pipes, motor housings slowly corroding in the cold mountain water. The legacy of Habakkuk extends far beyond this lake in the Canadian Rockies. The project represented a fundamental truth about industrial warfare. In total conflict, the side that can mobilize unconventional resources faster wins. Britain in 1942 didn't have time to optimize solutions. It needed solutions that worked with what it had. An ice aircraft carrier was absurd by peacetime engineering standards, but peacetime engineering standards assumed time was available. In war, time was the scarcest resource of all. The principles established by Habakkuk prioritize construction speed over theoretical perfection, use abundant materials instead of optimal but scarce ones, accept unconventional trade-offs that would be unthinkable in peace, defined much of the Allied victory. The Mulberry harbors built for D-Day were floating concrete docks, which violated every principle of efficient harbor design but could be constructed quickly in Britain and towed to France. The Bailey Bridge, a prefabricated modular system, was heavier and less efficient than permanent bridges, but could be assembled in hours by combat engineers. The Liberty ship was slow, inefficient, and prone to cracking, and won the war by being buildable in numbers that swamped German sinking rates. Modern military innovation still wrestles with the same tension. Is it better to wait for the perfect solution or deploy the imperfect solution that's available now? The F-35 fighter program has consumed 20 years and hundreds of billions of dollars pursuing technical perfection. Ukrainian defenders in 2022-2023 modified commercial quadcopter drones to drop grenades, crude, inefficient, but available immediately. Both approaches have merit. History suggests that in actual conflict, availability trumps optimization every time. Pykrete itself never found a practical application beyond the Patricia Lake prototype. Modern composite materials engineering has far exceeded what wood pulp and ice could accomplish. But the concept that inspired it, reinforcing a brittle matrix with fibrous materials to create something stronger than either component alone, underlies carbon fiber, fiberglass, and most contemporary structural composites. Max Perutz' Nobel Prize work on protein structures used crystallographic techniques he developed studying ice. The connection from Habakkuk to modern biochemistry is direct and traceable. Geoffrey Pyke died alone in 1948, largely forgotten. His habit of attacking problems from unconventional angles, the very quality that made him valuable to Mountbatten, alienated him from the establishment after the war. The post-war world wanted conventional solutions delivered by conventional people. Pyke's genius was too uncomfortable, too destabilizing. Yet every significant military innovation since has followed his playbook: identify resources the enemy isn't using, exploit them in ways the enemy doesn't expect, accept that unconventional success beats conventional failure. Perhaps the deepest legacy is symbolic. Habakkuk proved that when a nation faces existential threat, the only unreasonable ideas are the ones that aren't tried. Britain in 1942 couldn't afford to dismiss ice ships as ridiculous. It couldn't afford to dismiss anything. That desperation drove innovation in 1,000 different directions, most of which failed, but a few of which succeeded decisively. The ice carrier never sailed, but the willingness to attempt it, the organizational culture that said test this before rejecting it, was the invisible weapon that mattered more than any physical system. Today, 50 feet below Patricia Lake's surface, steel pipes and wooden beams rest where they've lain since 1944. They're the grave marker for a ship that never was, but they're also a memorial to the principle that in total war, the only unforgivable failure is refusing to try the impossible. Because sometimes, as Churchill and Mountbatten and Pyke understood, the impossible is the only thing that might work.